Caroline Matilda was not a princess born into a vibrant and glittering court life surrounded by social gaiety, but rather a princess born into a secluded and stifled way of life to a grieving mother. Her beginning was a foreshadow for how her loneliness would continue into adulthood and bring about her own downfall. She was born on the 22nd of July 1751 at Leicester House in London. Caroline Matilda was the daughter of Frederick, Prince of Wales, himself the eldest son of George II, and Frederick's wife, Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, as their ninth and youngest child. Unfortunately, around 4 months before her birth, Frederick had died suddenly at the age of 44, possibly from a pulmonary embolism. Added to this, he had become estranged from his father, the king, mostly over opposing his father's government, finally being banished from court in 1737. This made things somewhat strained between Augusta and George II at first, but as she was only 32, now a mother of 9 children and mother to the heir apparent, she was shown sympathy and given the same honours as the Queen at the few social events she appeared in public. But that in itself became a problem. Augusta rarely appeared in public, and she also chose to not allow her children to appear in public. Instead, she kept them secluded in the family environment at home, not bringing them to court, and allowing few people outside the family to actually meet them. Augusta would be criticised for this from all corners of the population, but for Caroline Matilda it was a happy childhood, and she grew close to her siblings, especially her older brother George, the future George III, and her sister Louisa Anne. Most of the time they lived at Leicester House, but in the holidays they would go to Kew Palace near the banks of the River Thames. She was given a very basic education, but was described as intelligent. Caroline Matilda preferred outside pursuits and riding, and was musically gifted, learning to play the harpsichord at a young age and having a beautiful singing voice. And despite her patchy education, Caroline Matilda enjoyed reading and was able to speak at least 3 other languages alongside English, Italian, French, and German. On the 25th of October 1760, the family was changed overnight as George II died suddenly at the age of 77. Augusta's eldest son now became George III of Great Britain, and he moved to Windsor Castle. By 1764, when Caroline Matilda was 13, plans started to be made for her marriage, and her brother recognised the potential for a political alliance. Talks began between the Swedish House of Oldenburg and the British Hanoverians, specifically for a match for Christian, the Crown Prince of Denmark, and a British princess. The marriage was considered to be pretty good on all counts. The families were close, as Christian was a first cousin to George III and his siblings. Both families were Protestant, and they were the same rank. By the 10th of January 1765, all was agreed, and George III, with the approval of Parliament, made the announcement that once their respective ages would allow, Caroline Matilda would marry Christian. Christian's mother, Queen Louise, was a daughter of George II, and so the marriage was seen as a renewal of connection between the two countries. At this point, Caroline Matilda didn't even actually know she was now engaged. However, Christian was not as happy a person as Caroline Matilda. When he was only 3, his mother Louise died, and his new stepmother, Queen Juliana Marie, showed no interest in him, especially once her own biological son came along. Over the years, his alcoholic father, Frederick V of Denmark, also paid little attention to his son, and this must have been devastating for the young boy described as shy and sensitive, although also charming and intelligent. Something that would not become clear until his later years was that Christian suffered from mental health problems, today thought to be possibly schizophrenia. However, how much of this was down to his upbringing and how much was genetic is up for debate. Halfway through the wedding negotiations, King Frederick died, leaving his son Christian to become King of Denmark and Norway on the 14th of January 1766, just a few weeks shy of his 17th birthday. A proxy wedding was celebrated on the 1st of October that year, and Caroline Matilda was now officially going to be a queen, although, as would become clear in due course, she was given very little in the way of preparation for this role. Her upbringing had sheltered her from the politics and social posturing of court and left her with little taste for either anyway. Still aged just 15, she left England on the 3rd of October from Harwich in Essex for Rotterdam, and 3 weeks later crossed the River Elbe in the Danish Duchy of Holstein, now part of modern-day Germany. Here, she left behind her British entourage and was passed over into Danish hands. 12 days later, Caroline Matilda arrived in Roskilde, and this was where she first met Christian. Little is written of the meeting, which suggests it at least went as expected, and the two didn't openly dislike one another at the time. On the 8th of November, she made her official entry into the Danish capital, Copenhagen, to rapturous cheers from the people. Later that day, an official wedding ceremony took place between Caroline Matilda and Christian in the royal chapel at Christiansborg Palace, the royal residence. The wedding celebrations and balls would continue for another month, but already the cracks began to show. In early December, Caroline Matilda wrote a letter to her brother George, saying that after a mere week, Christian did not want to be troubled with her. There could be many reasons behind this. The young king did not seem to be in a hurry to consummate the marriage, and some at court thought this was due to Christian feeling forced into the marriage, and others suspected he might have been gay. It's also highly likely that their young age simply played a part in this. Whatever the reason, the relationship between Caroline Matilda and Christian was difficult from the start. The Danish court and people were somewhat more welcoming of the young princess. People thought she was too plump to be considered a real beauty, but that she was still attractive, and that her looks allowed her to avoid criticism of women, but still captivate the male eye. Her personality was less formal than might have been expected, and many found her somewhat temperamental, but Caroline Matilda was also described as vivid and charming. While the common folk of Denmark loved her warm and down-to-earth character, it was looked down upon at the strict Danish court. On the 1st of May 1767, Christian VII and Caroline Matilda had their joint coronation, also held at Christiansborg Palace, and were crowned King and Queen of Denmark and Norway. Caroline Matilda found it difficult to fit in. She sent home letters lamenting of her inability to find her place, blaming it on the lack of preparation given to her at home in Britain. She was also put out by not being allowed to travel with her new husband on a trip to Holstein in the spring, and it was on this trip that Christian also began a relationship with a mistress, the first of many. The relationship between Caroline Matilda and Christian was so bad that Christian's tutor from his teen years, now his advisor, Élie Salomon François Reverdy, had to fake love letters from the king to his new wife in order to hint at something romantic between them. Christian's mental stability also started to falter further, leading to bouts of paranoia, self-mutilation, and hallucinations. Reverdy finally succeeded in convincing the king he had to consummate his marriage for the sake of the succession, and it happened sometime in mid-1767. But by the end of the year, Christian was now openly having an affair with a prostitute named Katrine Bentheim, also known as Stolet Katrine, and the two were known for their noisy nightly sojourns through the capital. Katrina was also a dangerous security risk for the country, as she held such sway over Christian and was likely responsible for the dismissal in the same year of Revedi. But it wasn't all bad for Caroline Matilda, and she did have some friends at court. Frederick V's mother, Sophie Magdalene, the grandmother of the young king, kept her own court, and from this would be drawn some trusted ladies for Caroline Matilda's own household. One of these would be Louise von Plessen, the Queen's senior lady-in-waiting, and the two women became close and trusted friends. Louise disliked many of Christian's immoral close friends and advisors, such as Conrad Hulk, and she also gave Caroline Matilda somewhat bad advice for her marriage bed. She suggested that if Christian showed any inkling towards wanting to go to bed with his new queen, Caroline Matilda should play hard to get, and this would make Christian want her more. This might have worked had the king actually liked his new wife and was simply shy, but it in fact only made him more unwilling. But on the 28th of January 1768, Caroline Matilda finally gave birth to the future heir, Prince Frederick. This ensured the security of the Danish throne, and Christian turned his attention back to the brothels of Copenhagen after his son's birth. As for Caroline Matilda, despite her disinterest in politics, she became more important at court as the mother of the heir apparent. The scandal caused by Katrina was enough that in January 1768 she was banished from the realm and taken to prison in Hamburg. Caroline Matilda might have felt slightly more secure in her position at this event, until Hulk succeeded in having Louise dismissed, leaving the Queen virtually friendless at court. She refused the suggested replacement of Anne-Sophie von Berkenten, whom she suspected had been part of the plot to remove Louise and would likely spy on her for Hulk. It wasn't until later in 1768 that the Baroness Margaretha von der Luhe agreed to take the position, and despite being Hulk's sister, got on well with Caroline Matilda. In May 1768, Christian left court to go on an 8-month visit around Britain and France, and this allowed him to have a change of scene, which appeared to help reduce his mania. Caroline Matilda was able to live a quieter life in Copenhagen, taking care of her young son. However, people were scandalized by her taking actual walks around the capital with her son, as noble and royal women at that time were expected only to travel by carriage. Nevertheless, she split her time between the courts of the Queen Dowagers Sophie Magdalene and Juliana Marie, and built up a good reputation for modesty and a good temper. But this was soon about to change. While the king was absent, Caroline Matilda made some new friends, namely the female courtiers Christine Sophie von Gela, Anna Sophie Bülow, and Amalie Sophie Holstein. They were known for their love affairs and love of partying, so unsurprisingly, they encouraged the 17-year-old queen to become more sociable, dance more, and most scandalously of all, to flirt. Christian finally returned to Copenhagen on the 12th of January 1769, bringing a new face with him, a physician he had met up with in Altona at the beginning of his trip, named Johann Struensee. During his trip away, Christian's mental health had once again deteriorated, but remarkably, Struensee seemed able to handle the king's ill health. The king's advisors were very relieved by this, and Christian himself came to deeply trust his new doctor. Although at this point Struensee had no political ambitions, he became a close part of the royal retinue. At first, Struensee was disliked by Caroline Matilda because of his first strange attempts at helping the king's health, which involved trying to set him up with a noblewoman named Birgitte Sophie Gabel. This was apparently because Struensee believed that a relationship with an intelligent woman would help make the king's mental instability more stable, which was an absolute double insult to Caroline Matilda herself. This failed, and then Struensee attempted to set the king up with other mistresses, which increased Caroline Matilda's anger towards him. Struensee was a known philanderer with his own love affairs, and so she saw him as no different from the usual scoundrels her husband made friends with. But this would start to change from July onwards. At some point, the doctor seems to have decided it was more beneficial to help repair the relationship between the king and queen, and he encouraged Christian to show his neglected wife more attention. Christian actually did this, throwing a 3-day celebration on the 22nd of July 1769 for Caroline Matilda's 18th birthday. Caroline Matilda wasn't stupid, however, and she quickly realised the king's newfound interest in her was down to Struensee. Struensee was apparently quite charming, and Caroline Matilda began to take more notice of him. When, during the summer, she had an attack of dropsy, Christian suggested she ask Struensee his advice. Warming up to the doctor, the queen did this, and Struensee told her she needed to exercise more and enjoy entertainment such as dancing. This helped reduce the water retention in her legs, and Caroline Matilda's confidence in Struensee grew. This was only increased further when he successfully inoculated the toddler Crown Prince Frederick against smallpox, a very new procedure at the time. It started to become obvious that there was an attraction growing between the pair, and it's hardly surprising for Caroline Matilda, considering how lonely and isolating her life was. Oddly, Christian himself seems to have been aware of the romantic relationship stirring between his physician and his wife, and allowed this cuckold situation to continue, somewhat willingly, if not publicly. By January 1770, Struensee had his own rooms within the palace, and by the spring, Caroline Matilda and the physician were lovers. Christian became more withdrawn and passive as he entrusted more and more of his state affairs to Struensee, something that worried the king's advisors, and rightly so. During that year, when the royal couple took a tour of their provinces, they were accompanied by Struensee. He was observed behaving towards the queen in a very over-friendly manner, and rumours grew that the pair were romantically linked. Something about her newfound love made Caroline Matilda grow in her own confidence as queen, and she found a new resolve against those at court who had worked against her. By May 1770, Struensee was on the royal council, and the pair worked to remove Hulk from court. However, Struensee was now working to his own political gain, and he also had Margaret von der Loo removed from court, as she was the sister of Hulk. This likely didn't go down too well with Caroline Matilda, who was close to her by then, but she was under Struensee's spell by this point. When the court moved to Holstein for the summer, Caroline Matilda created even more scandal by appearing on horseback in equestrian outfits. This was something that she would be mocked for when the free press was finally allowed in 1771, ironically allowed by her lover, Struensee. Caroline Matilda's brother, George III, and the rest of their family were growing very nervous about the reports they were receiving about her behaviour. In August 1770, Caroline Matilda's mother, Augusta, made her way to Lüneburg in Hamburg to visit her daughter. It would be the last meeting between them, and Augusta was horrified when Caroline Matilda greeted her wearing breeches. It was obvious from certain language used that the Dowager Princess of Wales wanted to warn Caroline Matilda off from the affair, but as Struensee was by the Queen's side the entire time, it was impossible to speak of openly. All Augusta could do was instruct others to caution Caroline Matilda, including her other son William, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh, who visited his sister that year in Copenhagen. By September, another courtier had been removed. The Chancellor, Count Johann Hartwig Ernst von Bernstorff. The British royal family were aghast at this, as Bernstorff had worked to create an alliance between Sweden and Denmark against the rise of Russia as the dominant Baltic power at that time. When Augusta wrote to her daughter to ask about her involvement in this, Caroline Matilda's reply was arrogant. "Pray, madam, allow me to govern my own kingdom as I please." Christian was still allowing Struensee a great deal of power, and on the 18th of December, the physician became a privy councillor, and by July 1771, it was publicly declared that any order signed by Struensee would have the same effect as if it had been written by the king's own hand. Struensee was now effectively de facto ruler alongside Caroline Matilda. Between the 20th of March 1771 and the 16th of January 1772, he would hold complete power. But Christian wasn't completely forgotten by the Queen, or perhaps it was simply that she had to keep up appearances. To honour him on his birthday on the 29th of January 1771, Caroline Matilda founded the Matilda Ordenen, or Order of Matilde. This was intended to only honour the royal family and their closest friends. The presentation of this order happened that day at dinner time and included the king himself, Caroline Matilda, Struensee, the Queen Dowager Juliana Marie, and Prince Frederick, Christian's half-brother, as well as close friends of Struensee's. This order would later be abolished with Caroline Matilda's banishment, but it was a clear signal that the king was certainly not being pushed out by the two lovers, but rather that there was an uneasy sort of acceptance between them all. By this point, Struensee was basically king in all but name and issued the equivalent of 3 cabinet orders a day. This resulted in him being accused of having a mania for reform, but in fairness, the large majority of the reforms were modernising and very forward-thinking. Some of his reforms included the abolition of torture, of noble privileges, of nobles being chosen for places in office, banning the slave trade in the Danish colonies, allowing freedom of the press, introducing a tax on gambling in order to pay for the nursing of foundling children, assigning farmland to peasants, a reform of state institutions, the abolition of capital punishment for theft, abolition of the etiquette rules at court, and rewarding only actual achievements with feudal titles and properties, rather than it passing from noble father to noble son. It all sounds good, right? But I expect you can guess there were many people, mainly from the upper classes and aristocracy, who were not impressed with the changes. And despite his modern thinking when it came to reform, Struensee could be a bit too zealous in other areas. Caroline Matilda was heavily involved in her son Frederick's upbringing, but so was her lover. Struensee adhered strongly to the teachings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his ideas about returning to nature, but he had his own thoughts on how to apply Rousseau's philosophy. Frederick would receive an Enlightenment education, but Struensee also believed Frederick should be largely isolated and left to do things by himself to create independence, and that much of his learning should be self-directed through playing with 2 young commoner boys. While there's nothing really wrong with this in theory, Montessori teaching is very similar, it seems Frederick wasn't always shown the affection you might expect alongside this, and he was rushed to learn things. Struensee also had other strange ideas, such as Rousseau's advice about the cold being beneficial for children being taken very literally, and he would order that the young prince was only sparsely clothed during the winter. Both Struensee and Caroline Matilda openly went against the traditions and customs of both the Danish and Norwegian nobility, and this pitched them against the more conservative members of court, not least the Queen Dowager Juliana and her son Prince Frederick. Caroline Matilda made this worse by introducing a law that allowed middle-class people to dine with the royal family, and she began to make friends outside the restrictive aristocratic circles of court. Struensee also only conducted business in German rather than Danish or even French, the courtly language, and he dismissed whole departments of people, replacing them with men loyal to him who knew little about the country they were now helping govern. At first, public feeling had been on the side of the new reforms, but as time went on, they began to dislike the way in which Christian was being sidelined. Caroline Matilda and Struensee now made no effort to conceal their relationship, and the Queen often went out riding dressed fully in men's clothing. Christian was mostly made to do as he was told, only occasionally lashing out at those around him. Once, when the king refused to do as Enevold Brandt, a courtier and one of Struensee's right-hand men, told him to do, Christian threatened to flog him. The two men ended up in a fist fight, and Brandt struck the king across the face. The shock of the court when nothing happened to Brandt for this was palpable. In June 1771, the court moved to Hirschholm Palace north of Copenhagen for the summer. Everything seemed idyllic, and the Queen was painted with her young son in the newest country style, living happily with Struensee like a normal family. Except that the situation was anything but normal. On the 28th of June, Caroline Matilda sent a letter to her brother George and his wife Queen Charlotte to congratulate them on the recent birth of a prince, one of her nephews. But what she failed to mention was that she herself was heavily pregnant. It was unusual to not share such momentous news. A few weeks later, on the 7th of July 1771, Caroline Matilda gave birth to a little girl, Louise Augusta. The event was greeted somewhat coldly. There probably wasn't a single person who really believed the little girl's father was Christian, but the king officially recognised her as his own daughter, officially a princess of Denmark and Norway. Dowager Queen Juliana agreed to be the girl's godmother if Caroline Matilda agreed as well. Whether this was from a genuine hope Louise was indeed the king's child, as for Christian to accept this, Caroline Matilda must also have still been sleeping with him as well, or from the king simply not being sure due to his mental state, or from a compassion for none of this being the baby's fault, Louise's position at court would never be in question due to her mother's behaviour. To this day, there is no way of really knowing the truth, but it does seem very likely Struensee may have been Louise's father. While Louise's birth was not itself the cause of the downfall that would now come to Caroline Matilda and Struensee, it may have been the catalyst. Rumours began after her birth that Caroline Matilda and her lover wanted to imprison the king and declare the queen regent in his stead. The whole thing made no sense, as the only way Struensee had any real power was if the king still lived and there was the pretense of putting out orders on Christian's behalf. But Struensee had made too many enemies, and Caroline Matilda began to worry that Juliana was plotting against them both. Again, while the Dowager Queen would later move against them, she hadn't at this point. Abolition of the freedom of the press was hastily brought in, but it was too late. There were whispers that Struensee had begged the Queen to let them both leave the country, but she had refused, and even that a British diplomat had tried to bribe Struensee to leave with a sum of money. Whatever the truth, both Struensee and Caroline Matilda were in danger by the time the court returned to the capital on the 8th of January 1772. Count Jacques Karl Rantzau, a one-time supporter of Struensee, had fallen out with him over a disagreement on political views, and he now saw his opportunity to overthrow his rival. Rantzau took fake evidence to Juliana, claiming the lovers were indeed planning to bump off and overthrow Christian, and this convinced her to move against the lovers. By the 15th of January, a case had been detailed and made against them in secret at Juliana's residence, and the conspiracy was to be enacted the following night on the 16th, after a masked ball held at Christiansborg Palace in the evening. Everything went smoothly, and Struensee and Brandt were both arrested and led away, along with many of their followers, and Caroline Matilda was captured and taken with her daughter to Kronborg Castle. Rantzau stated that only a single maid of honour, Frederica Louise Musting, could accompany the Queen, and unfortunately for Caroline Matilda, she did not get on with her. Other attendants would be added over the coming days, but they were all courtiers who disliked the Queen. Christian was driven around Copenhagen the next morning on the 17th in a golden carriage in light of his perceived liberation. The party was over. Struensee's interrogation began on the 20th of February, but was largely concerned more with his taking over of royal power than of his affair with the Queen. He claimed that the king had known of all decisions made and had agreed to them. Modern analysis of Christian's illness suggests he may have had schizophrenia, and the nature of this means he may indeed have acquiesced to the orders made, but not necessarily that he fully understood them at the time. A few days later, Struensee admitted to crimes of an affair with Caroline Matilda, but tried to shift much of the blame onto her. Alongside this, Caroline Matilda's household was questioned, and much of the evidence from her closest female attendants and ladies-in-waiting was damning. A committee of 4 nobles travelled to Caroline Matilda to interrogate her, but she refused to speak with them, stating that she recognised no court but the king's. At first, she denied the relationship with Struensee, until she was presented with his signature on a confession, of course. Caroline Matilda then changed her story to admitting the crime, taking most of the blame in a hope to save her lover from a worse fate, although there is debate over how much of this was forced on her. All the arrest warrants and orders were signed by Christian, but under pressure from his stepmother Juliana, which was a hint of the way things would play out from that point on. On the 8th of April, Caroline Matilda was notified that her marriage to Christian had been dissolved, and her name was no longer to be spoken in church services. Struensee was found guilty of a litany of charges, but principally with the crime of usurping royal authority, made worse by the fact he wasn't nobility. He and Brandt faced a terrible execution on the 28th of April. Both men had their right hands cut off before they were beheaded. Their bodies were then drawn and quartered. George III had been informed of his sister's arrest, and attempts had been made to secure her release. When it was discovered Brandt and Struensee might be allowed to go into exile from Denmark, threats were made to break off diplomacy between the two kingdoms, and British ships were sent to the shores of Copenhagen. But while Christian reportedly tried to see his queen and was prevented, he had managed to secure a promise that she was not going to be tried for any crime, and the return of her dowry was made to Britain. This suggests there was at least some truth to the story Struensee and Caroline Matilda told their interrogators, that the entire relationship between the three of them had been conducted with the knowledge and acceptance of the king. By May 1772, it had been decided by the British and Danish governments where to put the disgraced Queen. At the suggestion of King George, Caroline Matilda was to live at Celle Castle in his Hanoverian domains. On the 30th of May, Caroline Matilda boarded British Royal Navy ships and departed for Hanover. She would never again see her son Frederick and her daughter Louise, who both remained in Copenhagen with Christian. A court was organised for her by the time she made her official entry into Celle on the 20th of October, and she would rarely leave the city afterwards. Caroline Matilda led a quiet life at Celle Castle, and was reunited with her beloved Countess Louise von Plissen in her household. Her main entertainment became a library at the castle and a small theatre built for her amusement. Although she was still important as the mother of the heir apparent, she really wanted nothing to do with the Danish court except for news regarding Christian and her children. With Juliana now firmly in charge and her son, the elder Prince Frederick, 15 years the senior of the young Crown Prince Frederick, Caroline Matilda feared for her children. but she was also fearful over how her former husband was being treated. There were still those who were on Caroline Matilda's side, and they wanted her to return to Copenhagen as regent, taking place by the side of the crown prince. The Danes who wanted this were mostly centred about Hamburg, within easy reach of Caroline Matilda's court, and she reportedly was on board with the idea, but only if her brother George agreed. While the British king seems to have remained understandably impassive on the subject, he made it clear he would give his support, but only if the coup was successful in taking the capital and gaining power. Caroline Matilda wrote at least 4 times to her brother asking for his aid in this scheme for my son's happiness. But before anything could be arranged, Caroline Matilda died suddenly on the 10th of May 1775 after just a few days' illness with fevers and rashes. It's now thought she died of scarlet fever, possibly with other complications. She was only 23 years old. She was buried at Stadtkerke St. Marian's Crypt near her paternal great-grandmother, Sophia Dorothea of Brunswick-Lumberg, who herself had been divorced and sent into exile by George I. Although Caroline Matilda only lived a short life, she certainly made the most of it. She was a princess that divided opinion down the middle, and she continues to do so. On the one hand, she was a lonely and spurned wife, isolated in a foreign country with few friends and with a husband who wanted nothing to do with her. When Struensee showed her affection and attention, it's not hard to understand why she fell in love with him, especially as the two seem to have also shared many ways of thinking and shared beliefs. On the other hand, she cuckolded a husband who was possibly not mentally able to fully comprehend what was happening around him, and she allowed her romantic relationship to bleed not only into politics, but into the succession through the question of her daughter's parentage. Caroline Matilda was certainly modern in her thinking, in wanting to be friends with people of all social classes, of not caring for court etiquette, and seeming to enjoy shocking people when possible, such as wearing what she liked instead of what was expected. And what must also be remembered is how young she was. Like other tragic female figures, Catherine Howard, Marie Antoinette, being young and in public view made any character outside of the expected norm a very difficult fit, and Caroline Matilda was disliked for this by those who wanted the status quo to remain and liked by those who wanted change. Whether the opinion on whether Caroline Matilda was right or wrong in how she acted, she certainly became a focus point for an era where people began questioning how they lived, why they lived that way, and who they were in society. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.